I think we're in a better position than we were last year. I think sentiment is going in the right direction. I think we're going forward with optimism, albeit cautiously. We don't like to see these spikes in the market, but any appreciations are most welcome, and that has been reflected, I think, in milk checks most recently in the last week or so.
Hello, I'm James Dunne, and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast, where we bring you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Coming off the back of the highs of 2022, the production year of 2023 seen a sharp market correction in milk price. Plenty of farmers are budgeting forward, and one question which is always asked is the market outlook for the current year. I'm joined by Board BA Dairy Ingredients Sector Manager Margaret Butler to give some insight into just that.
We last year exported 1.6 million tonnes of dairy products directly from Ireland, and those products went to over 140 markets worldwide. So, we've got a significant export footprint. And in terms of where those products go, if we look at the main importing markets, so 6% went to North America and Canada, about 2% to Latin America, 60% of those exports go to Europe, so a really significant market for us. To Africa, we exported around 15%, 4% here to the Middle East, where I'm actually dialing in from at the moment, and 12% to Asia, into the combined markets within Asia. Yeah, I guess in terms of their priority or how important one is to the other, that really depends, I suppose, on your stance as to if you're an exporter, for example, what products are in your portfolio and what products are in your mix. But even just looking at those statistics, you can see that Europe stands out fairly distinctly there, with 60% of direct exports going to the European market.
How would they have changed over time, or are you seeing trends, Margaret, in terms of maybe how they're changing over time? Is the market changing in terms of the markets that we're actually exporting into?
Yeah, no, they definitely have. And look, I suppose since 2015 and since the abolition of quotas in Europe, I guess one of the tasks that the Irish industry took upon themselves, I guess, was, with potentially extra milk coming at us, where would that extra milk go? And they, I guess, also on foot of Brexit, which followed thereafter, there would have been, a lot of considerations about maybe de-risking or diversifying, maybe from maybe a reliance on the UK market as well. So we've seen increases certainly to the likes of Asian markets like Japan, where 10, 15 years ago we had a very, very limited footprint. And now the industry has grown significant business there, particularly in cheese, but also in other products and butters and powders as well, for example. Across the Middle East, we've seen significant growth as well. In fact, it was one of our highest performing regions last year, both in value and volume terms. So last year alone, the Irish dairy industry exported about 106,000 tonnes to the combined markets of the Middle East, which was up, I think, around 50% nearly on the previous year. We've seen a lot of products obviously still going to those established markets, which are still exceptionally important. So I'm talking now about the likes of North America, specific markets or countries within Europe, so the likes of Germany, the UK, as I mentioned, for example. But also we've seen significant increases over the last 10 or 15 years of exports from Ireland going to markets in West Africa, for example. So yeah, we have seen certainly a change of portfolio, and a lot of people talk about China within the Asian context, and still a very important market for us. But we would, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be aware that the market for infant formula has changed there in recent years. That's not all negative by any stretch. Our industry, they still remain exceptionally agile, and we see other opportunities in that region as well, particularly in the likes of adult nutrition, life stage nutrition, and indeed into those really value-added products like sports nutrition, and even potentially in the future, products that kind of meet specific medical needs, or have specific health call-outs or health claims.
You mentioned that space of value added, and a lot of farmers would hear in terms of industry, in terms of there's been a lot of growth in terms of our milk pool since 2015, since quotas were removed. But maybe a lot more of the conversation now is actually adding value to that milk pool that is being produced. Can you just maybe explain what's happening in that space? Because I think maybe for farmers to understand that, ultimately, how do we add value in terms of product? And is that likely to have an impact on farm gate milk prices?
So yeah, and you're absolutely right. We hear an awful lot about, a move from volume to value, and that's absolutely where the industry has been for the last number of years. And I guess really what that means is, dairy is a commodity. So we operate in a commodity space, and as such, and given, the fact that we are a net exporter, and we talked earlier about the various different markets that we export to, we are, we are very much influenced by the macro factors that happen, and sometimes they can be to our advantage and sometimes to our disadvantage, unfortunately, as was the case last year. With the milk, with market returns, not, I suppose, being where they were for the previous number of years. But in terms of, I suppose, what we mean when we say adding value or value added, essentially, you're trying to take what is a product that, plays in a space, for want of a better description, in a commodity market, and you're trying to customize that. So you're trying to make something that is, for want of a better phrase, freely available. You want to make that as niche as possible. And one of the ways certainly that you can do that, and this is what our industry has done very well over the last number of years, is to really understand the markets that they are want to invest in, and inherently to really understand, what consumers in those markets want. So it's about meeting those demands and those requirements from those consumers. Because effectively, if those consumers are looking for a certain type of a product, or maybe it could be like a fortified product, for example, or functionality is a key piece for the dairy products that we export. All that information is highly valuable, and will and should infer that what was maybe once a commodity product now is seen as a value product that can be really used in whatever channel you're talking about. So, for example, for an ingredients channel, so I'm talking about bulk product that goes into a market for further manufacture, you'll hear a lot of conversations around functionality. So people will, customers will buy product based on that product's ability to function for whatever application or end use they intended for. And that's true of, all products across, the three main categories of butters, powders, and cheeses. So really that's what we're talking about when we talk about value add. It's about responding to the needs and the demands and the wants, indeed, of the market, and being able to supply that from Irish dairy, in effect.
Is that a short-term thing, Margaret, in terms of, is that in the next 2 years, 3 years? Is that something that has to be worked on over 6, 7, 8 year, 10-year period? Like, when are farmers maybe likely to ultimately see that deliver in terms of farm gate milk price? Or maybe it's delivering already?
Yeah. I think it is, but I think it is a bit of both. This is the continuum, if you like. It's something, I don't think any of the dairy processors or exporters are going to change their mind and turn away from value add. It is all about, as I said, moving away from volume and focusing on value. And that's something that the industry have been doing for quite some time now. In terms of, I suppose, the question about whether that has come to fruition or whether it will come to fruition, I think it has come to fruition. It's very difficult maybe to put a price point on it. But as I mentioned earlier, we're now competing in markets where, we weren't maybe this time 10 years ago, or certainly not at the same sort of level. So, we are, I suppose, competing with the best of them in the likes of Southeast Asia, which traditionally would have been, a market for the likes of the Oceanian suppliers. But, we are there now, and certainly from talking to both industry here and also customers there, we are recognised as well for our credentials in terms of how we farm. So I think it is paying off, and I think it will into the future. But the industry here are absolutely steadfast in they want to be in that space, and they want to partner with customers in these markets. So there's a lot of, obviously, dairy that is traded around the world, but the closer you can get to the end customer or the end consumer is where you'll really understand what those needs are, and hopefully partner with them well into the future. But I guess you have to start maybe slow and build up. But I don't see it as something that's going to switch off overnight.
Very good. You mentioned it, Darren, in terms of, maybe we'll switch back to the more immediate outlook in a moment in terms of for 2024, but our sustainability credentials, because it's one question I did want to ask in terms of, I suppose, what ultimately are the buyers maybe is are the buyers and the consumers on the one page in terms of what's actually required, and obviously in terms of we rank very highly in terms of our credentials on the world market. How is that giving us a positive in terms of the marketplace?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose we would absolutely consider it as a key positive differentiator. That Irish dairy has these credentials, and the way in which we dairy, differs from a lot of maybe our competitors, if you like, that are out there. In terms of, I suppose, a rating or a ranking or a prioritization, if you like, that does vary from market to market. And I guess there is a body of work that is consistently being done, but we still have to do into the future. And I mentioned the likes of maybe the combined markets of Southeast Asia and the likes of Japan. Sometimes the message there is it's an educational piece in the first instance about what is Ireland, where is it, because a lot of these consumers have they have never they obviously a lot of them have never been to Ireland, let alone know how we dairy. So there's this whole piece around educating and making sure that people understand how we do dairying in Ireland, and indeed where we are and what we stand for. So markets are becoming more discerning. We get a lot of inquiries from established markets, absolutely. So again, the likes of North America and markets within Europe where we've had a footprint for quite some time. For those markets, definitely, like ourselves in Ireland, the sustainability piece is probably at the moment being spoken about a lot more fluently than maybe some of the other markets. But I think as an industry we would feel that it's all trajecting in the same direction. And I guess to your question on whether customers and consumers, if you like, are on the same page, I think they probably by and large are. But again, as I said earlier, we are dealing in a commodity space here, so sometimes. And we're just, we've come off the back of a fairly difficult and volatile 2 or 3 or 4 years at this stage. So at times, I guess, different priorities will take precedence. So, I think we all know about food inflation and inflation in general over the last couple of years. So if you're if you are an importing nation and you are, you are reliant on dairy to complement your diet or your existing dairy industry, your ability to be able to purchase products, sometimes it will, your criteria on where you purchase from, sometimes it will come down to price, and that is the reality. And I think it would be, it would be unfair maybe to suggest otherwise. But certainly the if you like, I'll call it the move, but now it's very much entrenched in many people's minds in many markets that they want to buy from a sustainable source, and they want to buy from a source of dairy that is continuing to inverted commas do the right thing, or however you want to phrase it, in terms of the environment and husbandry and all of those factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, I think what we have in terms of the Board B quality assurance requirements, I think it sets us apart to a lot of countries. Is it fair to say that?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose this is it can get very frustrating at times, because you have a lot of countries saying a lot of countries, I guess, saying a lot of things. And I guess one difficulty is that maybe we're not all singing off the same hymn sheet. So when we go out with our credentials, we have a back catalogue, if you like. So we can attest to the proof points that we have put in place in respect of Irish dairy. I'm not sure that other countries necessarily have the same level of data as it were, but certainly I think we're justified in saying what we say and going out with those messages that we do.
Very good. In terms of, you mentioned in terms of the volatility, and obviously all farmers will be acutely aware as to what happened in 2022, but ultimately as a result in terms of the market correction that was seen in 2023. Can you maybe just outline why that was and what happened in the markets, and we'll look forward then to 2024?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the first thing I'd say is, and look, I've said it already, but so dairy doesn't operate in a vacuum, and we are operating in a commodity. So as such, we are, there will be headwinds and tailwinds in any given year that will affect the competitiveness and the ease of doing business. The other thing I'd say from an Irish perspective, and we talked about the figures at the start of this conversation, but we are a major net exporter. We export, the figures vary now, but probably north of 90% of what we produce. So we're heavily reliant on the key fundamentals of supply and demand. So, if demand peters off, it will have an effect most likely on ourselves as that big exporter of dairy, but also on the other major exporters of dairy. They talk about the big five, and these are kind of the metrics that everyone looks at: supply and demand. So I guess when we look back over the last 3 or 4 years, so I guess when we look back to maybe this time 2020, we were just probably living in ignorant bliss maybe at this point in time, because obviously none of us knew the ramifications of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So, at first when COVID happened, I guess, there was a significant dip in dairy prices, and you had people, talking about all sorts of things from private storage aid again to intervention. And thankfully, none of those things happened. But what actually did happen was, and it was a result of probably two things. One main factor really was buyers had to change the way in which they procure or purchase product, largely for fear that they would be left short. Such were the challenges around supply chains and logistical channels being closed off, again, a direct result of the pandemic. What that did was it drove prices nearly to echelons where they had never been before. Now, prices have spiked before, and that's fair to say, and absolutely that's nothing new in dairy. But what was new at that time was that usually you'd have a product that would spike within the product mix of dairy. So usually, for example, butter might spike and skim might not, or vice versa. Back in 2020 and throughout a prolonged period into 2021 and 2022, we saw nearly all dairy products increase in cadence with each other. And if you look at any of the indices or the historical price data, you can see that quite clearly. So that in itself was very unusual. So a very difficult situation for, to be fair, processors and exporters to manage. But I suppose you could say happily at that time it did mean that because there was such pent-up demand against relatively, at that time, flat supply, the fundamentals of supply and demand were weighted on the demand side. In other words, there was an awful lot of customers, if you like, looking for a product, and they were willing to pay for it, and they did at those very, very high prices. And that in turn was reflected in the milk check. What then happened, I guess, and a lot of things happened in that period of time. I mean, we had the outbreak of war in Ukraine. We had the pandemic obviously still ongoing at different levels in many regions of the world, and many of those that we export directly to. But you also had, I guess, effectively, food inflation as well. I knew that there was a third one. Food inflation was a huge consideration. It still is for many markets, but certainly throughout last year and to the latter half of the previous year, it was a major consideration. So in other words, people's ability to buy certain products was somewhat diminished. And dairy was also, I guess, one of those products or those categories that was affected by that. So, we've talked about the current 2020 into 2021. And if you bring it up to 2022, certainly up to around the summer of 2022, we did see initially, I guess, maybe a stabilization in prices. But from, I would say, maybe a summer, certainly into the autumn and into the winter of 2022, there was definitely a more bearish leaning sentiment for dairy. In other words, prices were coming down and demand wasn't there to meet it at a certain level where prices could be sustained. And as you rightly say, as we came into 2023, then reflecting those diminished market returns for dairy products, or for the basket of dairy products, a market correction was taking place. But I guess that correction also, unfortunately for dairy farmers and us in the industry, meant that depreciation, if you like, had to be reflected in milk check, because the milk check at that time was no longer reflecting what was actually attainable from the marketplace. And hence we saw a fairly difficult year last year, in part because milk checks had to realign with where the market was, but also not to discount the challenges around food inflation. So whilst one thing was going down, other things were going up. So I guess in a nutshell, that I hope with some kind of countenance or some kind of colour on what's happened over the course of the last 3 years, and 3 or 4 years at this stage. But again, I think it is really important to take dairy, and it's not exclusive to dairy or peculiar to dairy, but any commodity you kind of need to look at in over a course of 5, if not more years, just to get a context of what has happened, because one year's macro headwinds and tailwinds can feed into another. And we have come out of a fairly volatile period for dairy at any rate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent synopsis. And you'd hear it mentioned ultimately in terms of, you say there in terms of a switch and in terms of maybe how buyers were actually purchasing in terms of buying product and sitting on a certain amount of product. Like, I know we spoke last week, as some of that product in terms of, you mentioned that maybe is actually only filtering through the system towards the end of maybe 2023 and into early 2024. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess there would have been a theory last year, I guess, and I suppose in support of why markets were so weak, that there was probably inventories were higher maybe than demand could keep up with, if you know what I mean. So in other words, buyers had, as I said, during the COVID period for quite some time, switched their buying behavior from a buying just in time, so just having enough stock, to keep you going versus what your demand needs were. And they switched from that to a just in case. And that, as I said earlier, was all kind of born out of, you could call it panic or uncertainty or whatever, but, the need to have stock. And a lot of it for fear of the unknown. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. And as it turned out, the pandemic, I suppose was protracted for a long period. I guess if you were a buyer in that situation, and you bought very expensive stock, as it now turns out, versus maybe where we are today or more normal times, you would be wise and prudent to use that stock as much as possible before topping up again. So we've probably, in a way, gone full circle and went from a just in case situation, which, saw inventory maybe climb to levels where normally wouldn't be the case, filtering back to maybe a just in time situation over the course of the last 6 months, 12 months, where people, were working through that expensive inventory that they had in stock and only going out to the marketplace to buy more, when they absolutely needed to. That also obviously affected cash flow situation for many companies during the pandemic, and coupled with inflation, that was kind of like a perfect storm, you could say, maybe last year. If we were having the same conversation last year, I think that would be probably a valid point at that moment in time. So yeah, I think, we're hopefully in a more kind of state of equilibrium now. But again, as I said earlier, the fundamentals of supply and demand are always the two to watch. And for us as a major exporter, as I said, over 90% roughly of our product gets exported every year. We always need to have a watchful eye on what's happening around the world and how that may affect us, positively or negatively.
Yeah, and that maybe brings us to probably the point that our listeners are eagerly waiting to hear in terms of, I suppose, looking forward to 2024, I suppose, in terms of where are those markets at, and I suppose what's the outlook for the remainder of the production year 2024?
Yeah, and look, it's a really difficult question to answer, but look, I'll give it my best shot. And going back to, I suppose, what I just said, supply and demand. If you were to look at it on paper right now, the fundamentals, I would say, are probably slightly tilted to the supply side, by which I mean, in terms of the forecast for global milk supply for 2024 appear to be quite flat. In other words, we're not expecting any major appreciations or growths on the output that was the year that's just gone, 2023. That being said, and if demand, increases, or, if there's decent demand, that should infer that, where demand maybe outpaces supply, that causes markets to be buoyant or more bullish, to use kind of economic language. I guess the big question mark here is demand. Okay, so demand is something, and I think we briefly mentioned China earlier on, and one of them, China is a major, I suppose, contributor to demand sentiment. It's not the only one, but it's a major one. And I suppose we haven't seen China kind of dip back into the market in a majorly meaningful way yet. Now they have come back, that's true, and they're, as I said, they don't operate in isolation either. But the key question, or the key answer to your question, really is that ratio or that balance or imbalance of it maybe between supply and demand. So I guess if I had to put to be asked the question then in terms of what does that mean for outlook for the remainder of the year, and I mentioned to you earlier, James, we're here at Gulf Food this week in Dubai. It's a major international trade show, and it's one that's heavily I suppose, visited by dairy companies from all over the world, and we have 6 exhibiting with us here this year. The sentiment this year, I think, is certainly more positive than it was last year. I'd probably, encapsulate it by saying it's cautious optimism. The volatility hasn't gone away. Volatility will be here to stay, but certainly the outlook, I think, and the current sentiment is leaning much more in favour of a better year than last year. In the last week alone, since we spoke last, we have seen pent up demand for butter in particular. So that's positive. The key question there is this representative of true demand, and will it continue, and how long will that continue into the future? Or is this just a kind of a blip that maybe a few buyers have left themselves short, and there was a kind of as I said, pent up demand towards the back end of last week. But I suppose, to succinctly answer your question, I think, cautious optimism is where we are at the moment. It's still very early doors. Okay, it's gone past the middle of February. We're still not into our main production season yet. But I think if I had to hang my hat on it, that's where I would at this moment in time.
Okay, very good. One other question maybe I have for you, Margaret, is, and you'll see it a lot in terms of in farmer groups and stuff, looking at various different indexes, global indexes and milk pricing indexes. I suppose, for example, the GDT, the PPI, the Dutch index, where ultimately does that information come from, and what impact does it have on Irish farm gate milk prices? Or is there one particular index that farmers maybe should be looking at over a period of time that gives us a better prediction in terms of Irish farm gate milk prices?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a very timely one, because there is a GDT event due out any moment now, and I know that all my colleagues in the industry who are at the show across the road from where I am now will be eagerly looking at the GDT this week to see where things land. It's a good question, and I suppose it depends on where you are within the supply chain. So if you're a major exporter, as distinct as from a dairy farmer, exporters and buyers will look at these indices as a gauge as to where markets are and where markets potentially are going. Now, ultimately, their conversations between buyers and sellers will be, they're the true litmus test of where markets are going. So, I wouldn't always rely on an index, far from it, to pinpoint what's happening in a market. But I mentioned, and you mentioned, the GDT and the Dutch and the EEX as well. Again, it probably depends on where your products are being sold. So, for example, there would be a strong maybe Asian and Southeast Asian and Chinese buying patterns associated with the GDT, and maybe a kind of heretofore anyway, a lot of Oceanian product sold within that auction. Closer to home, then we have the likes of the EEX, which is typically, I think, an average of European prices over the previous week, and also the Dutch Dairy Board quotation that comes out every Wednesday as well. So I suppose, again, it depends on your point of view, but from a farmer perspective, look, they're all informative. I guess from a processor and exporter perspective, you'll kind of want to maybe not be too reliant on one. You're going to want to take all that data in the mix, as well as those conversations and that tacit knowledge that you have about the markets, how they normally operate, as well as those conversations that you're having with your customers. Arguably, you probably would say that maybe, or arguably you could suggest that the European indices are closer aligned to Ireland. There's nuances within that as well. For example, we are an island. We have to ship our product off the island to move it anywhere. Whereas those prices often quoted in the indices in Europe, they're maybe ex-works continental Europe, so they're not necessarily reflective of what a price would be to an Irish exporter were they to export or sell to buyers on the same basis. So look, I guess in the round, I think they are very informative. There are definitely tools that are used by the industry, and they manage risk to a degree. But it's probably a combination of it's probably a combination of all of them, or a select few of them, that you'd probably choose to maybe hedge your bets on. But certainly they are utilised by the industry en masse and globally, not just at home in Ireland.
One last word, if you were to say something to farmers in terms of the 2024 markets, just to wrap it up with regarding milk price, I don't think I could ask you in terms of giving me a farm gate milk price, but I'd say you ultimately aren't going to give me that. So maybe one last word in terms of, look, at farmers are 2023 was a difficult year in terms of costs remained high, as we spoke about that market correction. Costs obviously are going to remain relatively high in terms of the predictions for 2024. A lot of farmers will be doing budgets, so on and so forth. So maybe one last comment for farmers on the ground.
Yeah, look, I think to sum it up, I think we're in a better position than we were last year. I think sentiment is going in the right direction. And again, not I know I'm sounding like maybe a broken record at this stage or in danger of repeating myself, but I think we're going forward with optimism, albeit cautiously. We don't like to see these spikes in the market, but any appreciations are most welcome, and that has been reflected, I think, in milk checks most recently in the last week or so.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and many thanks to Margaret Butler for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.